welcome you to the Policy Center for the New South and thanking you for joining us in this important expert debate on the specific challenges and innovative solutions for drug control in low and middle income countries and countries of the New South. So we are here today thanks to the support of Sakina Majidi and Zinab Fathi of the Policy Center and West Africa and Global Commission on Drugs. I would like to renew my gratitude to them for providing this platform for this important and timely discussion. So usually known as transit and production countries, governments in the New South have to address multifaceted challenges related to drug policies, from increasing consumption, limited judicial and health capacities to uphold human rights and respond to the needs on the ground, to corruption, to even the militarization of civil security in some countries or the use of extrajudicial killings. So nevertheless, these issues keep on piling up, and the containment approach that has been pursued is more and more strained, and as highlighted by the mounting violence, the overdoses, and over-incarceration without affecting, let alone reducing, the expanding drug markets. So more and more changes are occurring on the ground, and reforms are happening around the world, with countries recognizing the limits of a repression alone-based approach and the need for balanced and comprehensive approaches, including health and social interventions. So the New South countries experienced a myriad and large differences in their illicit economies and drug markets, from the substances preferred that change from Latin America to South Asia, as we will see today, from the legal frameworks and punishment for different drug-related offenses, where sentences are quite different from a country to another, in their budgetary, law enforcement, health, and social capacities to respond, and in their implementation of drug policy itself on the ground that differs much. They nevertheless share an almost universal commitment to the global objectives of significantly reducing or eliminating illegal drugs, and share historical losses of mild, ceremonial, and traditional uses of plants such as coca, opium, and cannabis that were classified since the early 20th century as illegal drugs. So after a full decade of massive public debates between 2010 and 2020 on drugs around the world in different countries around the world, today's discussion will take us around different countries to hear from researchers and practitioners from Colombia to Nigeria to India on the specific challenges related to drug control, but also on the innovative approaches that are born and adopted in the New South. So where do we stand currently with drug policy? Is drug policy still on national political agendas with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we're still in a pandemic phase in much of parts of the world. And are reforms that are still limited in scale here to stay, or are setbacks to be expected in months and years to come? So I have the pleasure to moderate this discussion and welcome our esteemed panelists joining us in Rabat from Bogota, from Jakarta, Abuja, Delhi, and Dakar. So the first speaker that we will have today with us is Isabel Pereira Arana, who is currently the research coordinator of the drug policy area at the Center for the Study of Law, Justice, and Society, de Justicia, in Colombia, with special emphasis on gendered impacts of drug policies, access to controlled medicines for palliative care, and drug dependence, and of course, implications of the peace process for drug policies in the country. Asmon Francisca, that joins us from Indonesia, is the senior lecturer in human rights and drug law at the law faculty at the Atmajaya Catholic University. The focus of her research is drug law and human rights, and particularly for people who use drugs in the criminal justice system, for women and children, protection relating to the health rights. Adeolu Adebi is a public health expert and a member of the West Africa Commission on Drugs, and also a youth leader in Nigeria. He facilitated the formation of the West Africa Drug Policy Network, served on the Johns Hopkins Lancet Commission on Drug Policy and Health in 2016, and on the expert reference group of Amnesty International for policy development on drug policy and human rights. He has also worked with multilateral agencies such as UNODC, UNICEF, and WHO. Our fourth speaker is Professor Vet Barua from Shanghai University, who joined Shanghai University after being based at the Center for the Social History and Health and Healthcare at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. So he works on the social history of drugs and the intersections with international policy, regulation, and public health in modern era. He's also the executive director of the International Center for Drug Policy Studies at Shanghai University. So he is working on monograph on opium in modern India and developing a project on public health and urban development in early 20th century India. And last but not least, Francois Petrel, who heads the Research and Awareness Unit at the UNODC Office for West and Central Africa, based in Dakar, Senegal. And his unit conducts the research on drugs and crime in the region, countries of West and Central Africa, including on drug use, drug trafficking, organized crime, and violent extremism. Before joining UNODC, Francois was a senior researcher at Amnesty International. So without further ado, I would move on into our panel discussion and start with the first question to our panelists and specifically to you, Isabel. Colombia's drug control has been reported to fail many stakeholders, such as subsistence farmers, other nonviolent illegal actors in the illegal market, or to reduce the size of this said illegal market. But Colombia succeeded in upholding democratic institution and human rights oversight body through a situation that is quite known around the world in terms of violence and the responses that have been given. So briefly, do you think that the 2016 peace agreement carries the solution to the drug market in Colombia? And what would be your recommendation for a new national and regional approach that would have a potential to reduce the violence and the power of transnational organized crime in Colombia and in the countries around? Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you, Khalid, and good morning to my colleagues. Good afternoon to you, to everyone over there. Thank you to the organizers, and I'm very happy to be in this space and share with colleagues from Asia and Africa, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of common experiences. So to answer your question, I wanted to frame first like the scale and the scope of the failure that you mentioned. Back in 2020, the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission, which is a commission created within the US House of Representatives, stated that all of Plan Colombia's efforts to dismantle the drug economy were ineffective. So after 20 years, the main donor for drug policies in Colombia questioned the effectiveness of what have we devoted our resources to. So we're really talking about a full-scale failure. And then to answer the specific question, I do not think the peace agreement offers a way out of the situation. It does offer a solution to certain problems of the drug problem, but it doesn't carry the solution to the drug problem. So it has the potential to rebuild citizen trust between the state and citizens that depend on coca. It has the potential to address socioeconomic underlying factors for growing coca, but it does not have the amount and the potential to solve the full-scale violence that we experience in Colombia for many issues. One of them is that the agreement was with only one of the actors in the drug economy, with FARC, with this one guerrilla, not with the diversity of actors that are engaged in drug markets. A second reason is that there is a market with a very large client base. So we're speaking of 20 million people worldwide that use cocaine, and that demand will not go away. So as long as there is a steady or even growing demand, and in a country like ours, which is a middle-income country that has vast territories, very unpopulated areas that people can just colonize at any time, and there is thirdly a know-how on the criminal economies, a know-how on how to deal, sell, transport illicit goods. And also because the actors are not only involved in the cocaine trade, these are networks of different types of criminal entrepreneurship. So the solution that we defend at the Justicia and many of the organizations working in Colombia is regulation, but we speak of regulation with a caution, because there are some caveats to be said about the potential of regulation. Firstly, is that Colombia is not fully ready now to speak of regulation in a detailed manner, to speak of how we transit to regulation. We can speak of the idea of regulation. We can speak in political scale debates of how regulation will hold certain benefits, but we're not there yet at the space where we can place a legal framework for regulation. We need to continue to place that debate. But secondly, my second caveat is that contrary to what some people say, regulation itself does not hold the key to pacify Colombia, to pacify our drug market, or even to pacify the factors that persist in the regions where there is such violence, mainly because of the reasons I mentioned before. there are a wide range of actors that are not only devoted to the drug trade. It is a country that is very vast in territory. Lands can be colonized. So we work in a kind of two-scaled and mutually complementing strategy. One is defending regulation, but the second is saying, well, what can we do within the limits of prohibition now? Because there needs to be a way to do things better within the limitations that we have now. So just to give out 3 ideas, and most of them are regarding how we follow the money and how we use the limited resources that we have. So back in 2012, when you look at the data, there were only 500 people convicted for money laundering in Colombia, only 500, while there were 40,000 people convicted for small-scale, low-level drug offenses. So follow the money not only in terms of where are these drug traffickers, drug kingpins, and criminal cartels getting their resources, but where are we using our resources? And this also means getting more smart in how we handle corruption within the state that allows for police and military institutions to let this transit happen, because there is cooperation there. And how are we handling that within a peace agreement framework that needs a stronger security sector reform strategy? And thirdly, and this I'm not very familiar with, but I do think there needs to be a lot more transnational cooperation towards those goals. So what if all the money that the U.S. has sent towards forced eradication that has done nothing, and they state themselves that has been ineffective? What if those sort of resources were directed towards more smart strategies? And I'll leave it there for now. Looking forward to hearing from the rest of my colleagues.
Well, thank you very much, Isabella, and I will get back to you with other questions on what you've said. I mean, it's been very interesting how you have spoken about not only the money laundering issues, but also on how regulation being still conceptual to some extent, and also being not the solution to all the problems. I will just transition very quickly then to Nigeria, also a country that faces issues with rule of law, with over-incarceration, with increasing overdoses related to opioid use as well. And speak to or give my question to Adeolu, who as a member of the West Africa Commission on Drugs, has been working and advocating towards reform and implementing that reform in the country as well. So Adeolu, I just wanted to ask you that through your own expertise and through your work with government, multilateral partners, civil society in the country, so do you think there's still an opportunity for Nigeria and ECOWAS country to start implementing more balanced and effective drug policies, because they're also facing quite a variety of challenges today, be it through the public health or criminal justice or security, national and regional security issues? So, and how to address this, also the issue of institutional capacity to counter organized crime and provide the needed health services at the same time, when we know of the limitations, of course. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Khalid, for the introduction and moderation. Thank you for the organizers for providing this platform for us to have this conversation, this debate around this pressing issue that oftentimes we do put is a pressing issue, but oftentimes do not actually occupy the center stage when we talk about national development. Back to the question you asked, does Nigeria have the opportunity at the moment to develop and implement a balanced and effective drug control response? I think Nigeria and other West African countries and even globally has a big opportunity, because if we look at for anybody with the knowledge of the policy cycle, you will understand that every component of a policy cycle presents an opportunity for a readjustment, right from evidence generation to policy formulation to the monitoring and evaluation and to implementation. Is a cycle, and at every junction of that cycle, there's an opportunity to look into what we are doing. How are we doing it? Are we doing okay? Do we need to take a step back and realign our strategies? So, but the challenge so far has been that most of the times the policies that we have, Nigeria inclusive across West Africa, is that these policies are often reactive and not proactive in nature, in the sense that we take on the challenge, oh, we have a drug problem, there's drug trafficking, and then we need to respond. If you look at, from your introduction, we mentioned the issue around drug transiting through West Africa to the thriving markets in Europe or North America and also to Asian countries. And most of the policies that we have, the laws we have within the region were developed when we considered West Africa as just a transit route. But now this is a region that has moved from just being a transit route. Drugs are not just in transit, but are also now being consumed. There's a local growing market. There's also the local production that is also ongoing. So how do we ensure, if we are only reactive, how do we ensure that we factor into our policies an approach, an engagement that ensure that the realities of the day are brought on board in what we do? So at the moment, the current situation provides an opportunity for us to generate evidence, to look at what is on ground and look at what we are doing at the moment, and then we strategize, reformulate our policies to be able to implement what is effective and evidence-based and not just being reactive to the situation on ground. And Nigeria as a country and some other West African countries at the moment have taken some giant strides in terms of advancing the health-centered approach to drug control. Now we have the implementation of harm reduction being implemented. Nigeria started a pilot implementation of needle and syringe program. Recently, we have countries like Sierra Leone, we have Senegal, also having Cote d'Ivoire implementing harm reduction programs. But the challenge at the moment is that some of these health-centered approach are also still wrapped up in the language of war on drugs, in the sense that we have health-centered services, being provided, but the language is still that of war on drug, where we talk about compulsion, we talk about still arrest, where the low-level drug offenders are still targeted for law enforcement. And we have the challenge where we don't really prioritize what is important, in the sense that the indicators that we still celebrate are still indicators that are politically correct. In terms of the arrest and the seizures, if you look into the media, even like you rightly mentioned in Nigeria, you see day in, day out, we talk about the arrest and the seizures that are being made, which of course there's a place of supply control, but in weighing our options, how effective or what is the impact of the arrest and the seizures in the entire response to drug. So this is still the challenge that we face while we are making some advancement. And one of the key things that we've seen that has helped in the advancement of the health program, like the harm reduction program, is the need for where advocates or stakeholders are pushed forward for a multi-sectoral response. Oftentimes, it's all criminal justice-centered approach, which we see leading much of the effort in terms of drug control response within the region. So at the moment, there is an opportunity for us to take a step backward to really see what are the things that we are doing. And like you also rightly asked, what are the things that could be done for effective crime control and the responses? First, we need to recalibrate in terms of what are the effective indicators that we need to bring on the table. And we also need to have at the back of our minds that each of these indicators, when it comes to drug control response, carry different weights in terms of their response. So if we keep celebrating arrest and seizures, in terms of effective drug control response in the long effect, the weight is actually very little, because you can talk about tons and tons of arrest and incarceration, but doesn't really change the structure of the market or doesn't change the availability and the consumption of drugs. So we need to really recalibrate and focus on what is really important and focus our effort on that. And then the other thing we also need to bear in mind is that our law enforcement need to be targeted. there's need to really focus on those who really waste so much within the drug trafficking business, and not just the low-level offenders or people who are not occupying a strategic position in terms of drug trafficking. So how do we ensure that we focus on targeted law enforcement people, the so-called the big fish, who are actually driving the business? Mm-hmm. And the other thing I want to mention is for us to do this effectively, we need to ensure the multi-sectorality of drug control to be at the center stage. Yes, the criminal justice system has a role to play, but we need to begin to see this from the development perspective. Today, we are talking about sustainable development goals. We need to bring all this on board to ensure that even if we are talking about prevention, overdose management, we are talking about lives of people that needs to be at the center. So sustainable development need to be, is a pointer to the fact that there's need for a multi-sectoral response to drug control response. And these are the things that we need to begin to put in perspective.
Thank you very much, Adeolu. And I see that also you do meet also with what Isabel was presenting on the other side of the Atlantic on targeted law enforcement, as you say, and the non-violent people on the ground being arrested more and impacted more on the need for development approach and for also building up the rule of law, etc. And thank you also for a very articulate presentation of the situation in Nigeria and on the indicators as well, which takes me actually to stay within the West Africa region and the need for technical assistance and support, and to direct my next question to you, Francois, and to actually ask you if, since, Adeolu has been addressing also these issues of a health approach and the need for it. We know, of course, that UNODC has been supporting also throughout the UNA's joint program as well, the harm reduction questions and supporting countries around the world. So I just wanted to ask you to give us tell us what is the state of drugs and crime related data really in all of Africa, specifically where you work, and also why there is an issue specifically for LMICs and drug policy, and what is UNODC doing about it? And finally, I would like to ask for some good examples of drug and crime that you use as a UN technical agency to inform policymaking and programming. And of course, to take also this opportunity finally to give you the floor to respond to any concerns that have been raised by Adeolu directly in his question. Of course, we still have about almost an hour of discussion, so we will have the time to come back on very, very much exchanges, but please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Khalid, and thank you to the other distinguished speakers. My name is Francois. I'm the research officer at UNODC at the Office for West and Central Africa based in Dakar. Thank you for the question. I think to go back to what Adeolu was saying, it's about putting people's lives at the center. And the problem is that if you don't have data, it's very difficult to put people's lives at the center. It's very difficult to put people's lives at the center if you don't have evidence of what's happening to them. And what we see at UNODC, particularly in West and Central Africa, is the fact that there is a gap in data when it comes to drugs use or any kind of drug-related data, actually. In the region, we know that the region is affected by different forms of drug trafficking. We hear, all the time about the seizures that have been made. 6 tons of cocaine, 17 tons of hashish in Niger. You have this disaggregated data on seizures. You know that there are flows. Flows going from Colombia to West Africa, perhaps towards Europe. But there is actually very little data available from the countries. There is a tool that we use that's a UNODC data collection tool that's actually mandated under the UN conventions to get data from member states on drug developments in their country. It's called the Annual Report Questionnaire, and it's striking that West Africa, West and Central Africa, and Africa in general is one of the regions where we get the least amount of submissions. And when we do get submissions, they often do not include analysis on how many people have been arrested on the drug-related charges, for instance, or how many people have died of drug overdoses. So, to be very concrete, for instance, in 2020, we received 5 submissions from West and Central Africa from the 23 countries that we cover. So we covered 23 countries in West and Central Africa. We only got 5 responses from states in the region about drugs and crime-related data. Sorry, drugs-related data. And it's not that and this is a problem in itself, and because it makes drug users invisible at the policy level. Again, if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have the data, it makes it very difficult to understand what the problem is. And the key consequence of this type of data is that then drug users are invisibilized, basically, at the policy level. So if you look at how Africa is portrayed, it continues to be, as Adeolu was saying, portrayed as an area of transit. It's about the cocaine that goes from South America to Europe. It's about the hashish that goes from Morocco to North Africa, and it's still very much presented in a way that's reduced to a transit zone. There is very little emphasis on what's happening to drug users in the region and how drug use is becoming an issue in the region. According to our estimates, just by projecting, for instance, the demographic trends in the region, UNODC estimates that drug use, the number of drug users in Africa will grow 40% by 2030. This means that Africa is becoming a market. There is an increase in users, but there is actually very little data on who those users are, what challenges they face. It's very difficult to know how many people have been arrested again, because there's just no, states are not reporting on that data. And it's not that it's not that that drug use is not an issue. Again, the projection of 40% increase in the number of drug users in Africa by 2030 is quite chilling. But if you look even at the little data that we have, it's also alarming. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, the estimates is that you have more than 4.6 million Nigerians that misuse tramadol, for instance. That was a survey done in 2017, 4.6 million Nigerians that misuse tramadol. In Niger, tramadol has become the first drug used by people who go to treatment centers. First report tramadol as the reason why they're consulting. There was a similar study done in Togo. 37% of the individuals surveyed, that they were between 12 and 24 years old in Lomé. So 37% of the respondents aged 12 to 24 in Lomé had used tramadol in the past. So, it shows that, again, you have the region that's becoming an area, a market for drugs. And again, the problem is that the drug users are not visible, and therefore the policies that should be supporting them and providing treatment centers are slow at being implemented. So what is UNODC doing about it? First, with a number of agencies, we're supporting states in collecting data. We are helping to put data governance in place to ensure that you have people from the health ministry that talk to the people from the law enforcement agencies, so that the data that we collect contains both elements, the information on seizures and the information also on health. And this is yielding positive results. We're getting more and more requests, for instance, to do surveys on drug use in the region. We've done one in Nigeria, we've done one in Senegal, we've done one in Côte d'Ivoire. And what's also encouraging is that once those surveys are out, then you see governments being more interested in putting treatment centers in place. Senegal has opened a methadone treatment center. Côte d'Ivoire in 2021 has opened a methadone treatment center, and Nigeria also has a strong treatment center. So this is encouraging. The fact that there is more and more governments being interested in data on drug use, and not just drug trafficking, but also drug use, and what this means for users, this is a positive development.
Thank you very much, Francois, and thank you for this presentation of different parts of the region and the issues specifically related to health that they're facing. As Adeolu was speaking about, harm reduction services have proven to be the response, of course, and we have seen also that Europe has developed those harm reduction services in the 90s and late 80s when it was facing the wave of HIV infection through drug injection. But I think that we will discuss it later, and I will get back to you on that discussion because I'm also very interested on how the collection of the data collection is separated between problematic drug use and between people who use drugs and do not actually face any problems, since we're the focus of treatment, whatever treatment that is. And that also opens up a huge question of what treatment is for different approaches and evidence-based choices on large spectrum to compulsory treatment that is used in Southeast Asia, which gets me to look at Asmon for the next question, and we transfer. So thank you very much for the first speaker. We're going to get back to discuss more deeply everything that has been said, and we move to the other side of the Indian Ocean now to the next question to Asmon. So Asmon, specifically in Indonesia, and this is something, of course, that has been seen in the media, especially lately in 2016 when there was the application of the death penalty for drug offenses. But there is an enormous over-incarceration and prison overcrowding that also reaches sometimes over 300% in some centers and prisons. And there's also the use of compulsory treatment that is against people's will and based on abstinence programs. So nevertheless, despite the harsh and really lengthy penalties and incarceration conditions in overcrowded spaces, so the illegal market remains significant. So just very briefly, where did Indonesia go wrong in its drug control policies, despite all the efforts it puts out there and all the efforts to address the illegal drug market, and what specific approaches could it adopt? And could any Indonesian reforms also influence the whole region? And when we know that the whole ASEAN region has a very punitive approach to the use, the trafficking, and the production of drugs. Thank you, Asmon.
Thank you, Khalid. Nice to meet you, though. We meet, I think, 2 years ago before pandemic, and I'm meeting you again today. It's incredible. And thank you for inviting me to listen also from all the regions expert. I think this is a really good opportunity for us as well from Indonesia to learn from other countries. Well, I'm not so proud actually what Indonesian have been done because as you said, we still have a problem with overcrowding. We still impose the penalties. We also impose the compulsory treatment for people who use drugs. Actually, Indonesia has problem with its corrections institutions in almost all closed setting places, from prisons, police or prosecutor detention center, or other centers in the name of rehabilitations for people who use drugs. There are some causes actually from the abstinence drugs policy perspective to the law and its implementations. I will give you some examples for that. First, regarding the pre-trials detention measures. The disproportionality and criminalizations of drug offenses that sentence people who use drugs with criminal penalties. Law enforcement perspective overuse criminal penalties toward most of the crime, regardless the severity of the violence, whether they are a small crime or even a heavy crime. So the other things is the perceptions of long imprisonments, verdict or punishment as a success for law enforcement duties is also one of the problems. So law enforcement is like do the competitions, how they can impose the long imprisonments, and how they can pursue the more heavier punishment to most of the crimes. And the other things is about the deterrent effect per se, covers up the primary importance of the goals of the correctional institutions, which is we focus on the rehabilitating and supporting the incarcerated people for better behavior, for example, or for their futures. So they really focus on how the law enforcement deter people. And however, we have some things that although it's not success yet. For example, in 2010, Indonesia proclaims that it has been moved from criminalizations to decriminalizations on drugs policy. However, the Indonesian decriminalization approach focused merely on placing people who use drugs, regardless the conditions, into the rehabilitation scheme or places. Until now, the other things that make this more complicated is Indonesia still use the war on drug narrative and the prohibition approach to zero tolerance of drug use or consumption. This is the single narrative that Indonesians use, and they proclaim that this narrative is very effective to reduce the illicit market, like you said before. But we know that how this narrative is failed in almost all the around the world, but Indonesia still believe on that. And there is also some research to see how the judge considerations to impose the criminal penalties based on the war on the narrative. Most of the judge decisions are based on that. Not only penalties like long imprisonments, but also the death penalties. So the war on drugs narrative is still the main obstacles to finding alternative non-criminal punishment for people who use drugs, such as administrative penalties. For example, in many countries, there are fine, social worker involvement, and other things. But Indonesia did not have much alternative on that. Indonesia also really focus on the illicit drug market alone, both in terms of demand or supply reductions. And nowadays, we also have problem with the harm reductions. This lead to we cannot expand the other possibilities, such as what we can see the other countries in ASEAN that now quite progressive. For example, in Thailand, the discussion of cannabis use is really moved forward. Indonesia is still stands still in their own narrative on this one, and it also leads to the discussion of research opportunity. Medical and health services discussions among people who use drug or palliative care that needs drugs prescriptions. And the last thing is, however, we can propose the decriminalization policy based on the health perspective due to the new Indonesian drug law discussions. Now there are ongoing discussion about the Indonesian new drug law. However, it's still complicated to gain the possibilities to open all the discussion regarding the progressive policy and approaches. But we still hope there is still hope on that. What the civil society doing right now is bring many cases to the court, and including bring the cases, the cannabis use, for example, to the Supreme Court and also to the Constitutional Court. So we hope the discussions among the experts and legislators can also more focus on the benefit of the drug consumptions and not only the illicit market that they can be, it's not easy to control. because Indonesia doesn't want to control it. Indonesia really want to avoid the discussion of drug use and drug consumptions. So regarding your last questions, I think I don't believe Indonesia can be a good leader, but Indonesia maybe can be a good followers on drugs policy reform. Well, it's because Indonesia is quite reluctant to open the discussions about the bad and the good things of drugs and how they can able to control it, because they always focus on the how to reduce and zero tolerance to drug use. I think I will end that one.
Thank you.
Hopefully, yeah.
Thank you very much, Asmon. Thank you. And thank you. Actually, just to explain a little bit your first sentence, there was a public event in January 2021 and was our very last trip when I used to work for the Global Commission. And Asmon was one of the last people we saw before the pandemic hit the world and everyone had to stop at the very end of January 2021. So a pleasure to see you again, of course, this time virtually. For the audience, Thailand, and there is a discussion about the descheduling and the personal use for all uses in Thailand currently ongoing, and it's descheduling from the drugs list specific. So that is the debate specific to Thailand and to Southeast Asia that is ongoing today. But you also have spoken about something that is really key. And before I just go to Ved, it is an issue that concerns us, and also, of course, Isabel works on it very directly, and Adeolu also. But if it is the access to controlled medicines, so those 12 medicines that are both scheduled in the drug convention schedules, but also are on the list of the model list of essential medicines of WHO that need to be available for people that need them. So just to remind, the latest data, for example, that is out and from the 2017 Palliative Cancer Lancet Commission, Palliative Care, the Lancet Commission for Palliative Care, that, for example, for morphine, 50% of the people that live in the least developed countries have access to 1% of the available morphine around the world. So this is a situation that is very, very specific to our countries and our parts of the world, with the lack of training, the lack of access, the lack of importing and of even training within the health system, that ends up in a lot of avoidable pain and suffering for medical palliative care, pain relief, even pediatric, etc., within the hospitals around. So, which gets me to the next question, and I go to Ved and actually, when we also address, that again, when we just speak about reducing the illegal market, so a lot of high-income countries have been able to reduce their illegal market by having balanced approaches between prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and repression. So, Ved, I would like you to take us actually to one of the countries that has been the homeland to many of these crops, including opium and cannabis, and and that has also that these substances that have been made illegal in the early 20th century, and we know a little bit of the history around them in South Asia and South and Central Asia. But today, there's still a mix of traditional use that exists, but also very harsh punishments for trafficking and illicit production, including the death penalty in India and in the countries in South Asia. And yet, it is now an emerging route for heroin and methamphetamine trafficking, and regional conflicts such as in Afghanistan do actually feed that the drug supply chain with everything that it carries throughout, and as in Latin America known, that geographical displacement and all the issues it brings with it. So could you just briefly share with us one or two of the main challenges that you think South Asia and India are facing currently, and what changes are really needed actually to have a more effective drug market, and what changes that take into account the local cultural context to respond to this? Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Khalid. It's great to see you again. And thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Unlike the other panelists, I think I want to take a slightly longer view on this. And when I think about South Asia and drugs, I see dichotomies all around in terms of policies, in terms about applications of these policies, the criminal justice system and the way it works, including the death penalty. I think the first dichotomy, as Khalid pointed out, is that this is a region where socially and culturally drugs have been in use for centuries. And yet when we enter the 20th century, we see these countries adopting the harshest systems of control. So that's the first dichotomy. The other dichotomy is that the problem of illicit smuggling of drugs across the region is seen as a new phenomenon, when in fact this has been going on for a good part of at least 2 centuries. During the British colonial period, we see tomes of documents where the British are trying very hard to control and stem the flow of drugs from Central Asia and from Southeast Asia into what was British India, a sort of undivided Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And then here again, the other thing that comes up as a historian is that during the anti-colonial phase in the early 20th century, drugs have entered this political debate, and the appetite for drug control and also social controls and judicial controls of drugs was something that was dominant in the anti-colonial phase. And post-colonial governments in the region seem to have followed that track of zero tolerance. And the death penalty seems to be at some level deeply connected with that historical positioning of nationalist politics. The only silver lining, I think, here is that I think Harm Reduction International in their latest report has said that the countries in the region in South Asia are the low application countries. So I'm glad that although the penalties are there in the statute books, executions haven't taken place. Having said that, I want to just briefly focus on the challenges. And I think the other panelists have highlighted these. But in the context of India, especially as an emerging economy, there are 2 things. So India is not just a transit country, it's also a large consumption country for illegal and illicit drugs. And that is increasing. And I think geopolitics is key. I mean, South Asia sits in the middle of 2 growing regions. And there's a lot of growing of drug crops within South Asia. And also, I think this transnational aspect of drug smuggling is something that has been facilitated by technology. We see the emergence of new technologies and increasingly even instruments like cryptocurrencies fueling this transnational organized criminal dimension to smuggling. The other aspect is, again, India is a major pharmaceutical and chemical industrial production center. And this brings with it a number of challenges. If you look at the case of fentanyl and tramadol that came up in the conversation, India is a major source of these precursor chemicals and opioids. The case of Africa and tramadol, I think there's been so much scrutiny that the Indian government has been trying to stem the flow. But when we look at fentanyl, because of actions that the Chinese government has taken in the last couple of years, India seems to have taken on to rephrase, India seems to have the gap in the market seems to have been fulfilled by Indian supply of fentanyl. But then again, there's a large local market for these pharmaceutical drugs. There's leakage. And in the recent report that the government of India came out with on drug use and addiction patterns, there were a number of new things that we hadn't seen in decades. And that is the use of synthetics and the growth in the use of synthetics. So this preference for these new synthetics, including methamphetamine. And of course, I'm a historian, so I don't really have solutions to offer. But from history, we see that closer cooperation between countries is one way that we can start to get a grip on the problem. And also that we need to look at this issue as a holistic problem. It's a problem that has national security dimensions. Narco-terrorism is a sort of significant factor in the region. And also, I think, finally, I would like to just quickly highlight that it's essential to also understand the other dimension of the larger problem of illicit drugs, which is the user. And the problems that stem from a criminal justice system that depends on quite draconian laws. And this entire region seems to have not tackled this issue. There's reform, I'm glad to note. So in the Indian Parliament now, there has been an attempt to legalize cannabis. But I don't think there's political will sort of that sustains such changes. But the user dimension is an important aspect when one thinks about tackling sort of the issue of illicit drugs. And promotion of harm reduction policies, decriminalizing or reducing sort of the impacts on lives of users needs to be a more significant part of the conversation. It's not just about stopping the flow of drugs or tackling consumption, but also taking care of the user. Yeah, I think I'll sort of just quickly end here.
Thank you very much, Ved, but I'll get back to you with a lot of questions, of course, because you have reached out on many important issues. So you touched upon, of course, the use of the technology, and we know, for example, that it's still as limited as it is, for example, where we have the best data in North America, and in Europe, it is about 1.2% of the illegal market. Overall, so it remains still marginal here as well, but of course it changes from region to region, and there's a need for a lot more research on crypto markets and on illegal drug markets online, and also on the discussion of precursors, both medical and non-medical, that is related directly to what you said on the new psychoactive substances and the synthetics and the new warning systems that are being put around, etc. So just before we go into this new second set of questions and exchanges, I just wanted to remind all the audiences that are following us today to send us all the questions through any platform, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. This debate is on, so feel free, and the panelists will have the time to answer your questions by the end of our debate and pretty soon. So just to go very quickly, and maybe now we will just go into the discussion and directly ask the questions. So my first one is to you, Isabella, as well, and really to say that, for instance, Latin America has had this experience of addressing or being at the forefront of drug trafficking and production, or has 20 years more experience than other regions in the world, and then, for example, West Africa, where Adeodo and Francois are. So what would be just your advice? What would you say do and do not do like us? Very briefly, and then just so to ask the question so that you three of you can speak at the same time. So Adeolu, just to you, for example, when you are working on looking for evidence, looking for best practices and the implementation, where do you look at? What are the regions? Do you look into high-income countries, or do you look to countries with similar institutional capacity and set up to Nigeria and other West Africa countries? And just finally, Francois, so if you just would like to also add a little bit on where you think that the best models and best good practice examples can be found in NMICs, and does UNODC do transfer that knowledge from a region to another in the world? So just if you can keep it very brief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalid. And I've learned a great deal listening to you all. So there are many commonalities with the Nigerian experience in particular that Adelu mentioned, but I'm going to speak of 4 things of what not to do, but basically they're all already mentioned in your interventions, Francois and Adelu. So basically is that the first is that even reform or even like small scale good policies are still wrapped up within this war on drugs narrative. And this goes back to the fact that we have a lot of local champions of prohibition, and you may have that in your countries as well. We were very naive to the fact that that was such a local belief. And it goes to speak about something that Bev mentioned or hinted to, which is how does colonialism and anti-colonialism also relate to the fact that we have this legacy of a very negative attitude towards intoxication. And those are our local societies, our local culture. So in Latin America, we've always spoken about how the US has imposed this policy, but we very much welcome that policy, and we neglected the fact of how we needed this social and cultural change within our societies, rather than looking into the external forces that were supposedly forcing us to do this, to be redundant. So that's firstly, to look more into what are the cultural and social changes within our existing societies. A second that Adelu mentioned was within the policy cycles and what are the missed opportunities that we're having there in terms of evaluating specifically life trajectories. So I think that Francois also spoke to this, and many of you have spoken of this, but what can we do to really incorporate indicators that speak of life trajectories? When you look, for example, at the 20,000 women that are incarcerated for drug offenses, are we measuring their social mobility or their children's social mobility throughout generations? Are we really, do we have enough data to know what happens to those families because of incarceration? The truth is we do not. So I think you might be in the West Africa region just in time to set up those mechanisms before it's too late and it's been 30 years and we'll just continue to perpetuate these policies. And then lastly, in terms of harm reduction, for example, in Colombia and in the Latin American region, we've really been slow in creating our own models of what harm reduction means. Our substance of impact is what we call bazuco, which is like a raw cocaine. That is our substance of impact. It's not heroin. So when internal donors, international cooperation comes with harm reduction programs, yes, it's very welcome for the 1,000 people. It's only 1,000 people who use heroin in Colombia. So yes, it is needed, but it's not our main concern. And we do not have national models or population-based models of what harm reduction would mean for our local communities, for our local populations. And I think that West Africa is just in time to create those sort of models.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And I give for these excellent 4 models, and I will give the floor to Adelu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalid. And thank you, Isabel, also for those things you mentioned, because these are great points that we also say to our policymakers to learn from what the experience within Latin American countries, because those things that you've gone through or are still going through are there for us not to go through the same thing. I mean, we've seen some of the challenges that has happened with the militarization of the response, leading to a lot of human rights abuses and challenges within communities. And one of the things also that we try to bring to the fore, because you asked where do we look at for when we're looking for evidence, is one of the things we've tried to do is to build a local capacity of civil society organizations and institutions to also be able to generate evidence within their own domain and be able to show this to the policymakers. For instance, it's very clear when you look at the wave of drug trafficking experienced in West Africa within the late 70s and the early 80s, you could see how it rolled on the economic downturn within the region. The economic issues provided ready-made foot soldiers to collaborate with the Latin American traffickers to move the drugs. Now, we are also having a lot of issues around poverty and economic downturn within the region. And we can see that also playing out all over again, the poor communities going into like the cultivation and farming of cannabis and other things, what have you. And one thing that was striking in one of the UNODC report and other reports that we've seen, that if you look at between 2013 and 2017, the number of dismantled methamphetamine laboratories reported to UNODC was averaging around 2 per year within those periods. But in 2018 alone, about 18 was reported of methamphetamine labs. The same thing in Nigeria, within those periods, you talk about arresting foreigners from Latin American countries who are trying to set up laboratories within the region. Before they bring the meth from Latin America through West Africa, but now it's being produced within our region. And there's also a technology transfer that has also been done, where you have the individuals within the region producing these drugs for export. So we are facing challenges that has an economic dynamics as well. So if we want to resolve it, we know that we also need to focus on some of these issues. And I also give an example of one of the things that we've done powerfully. There was a time we interviewed some young people who have been incarcerated for drug use, who have spent a minimum of at least 12 months within, in incarceration, and their basic offense was just because they are drug users. And we asked them, you are out of the prison, now have you stopped using drugs? And I tell you, 99% of them are still actively using drugs. So using the criminal justice system as a response to drug use within the region is not something that is effective. And one of them actually said to me, he said, it was right within the prisons, I was able to link up with a trafficking gang. And when I came out of the prison, I became a drug dealer. So he was arrested for drug use offense, but coming out, he became a drug dealer. So these are basic evidence within our own domain, within our own region, that we can tell to policymakers to say, look, repression will never work. We cannot get rid of drug use using guns and bullets within the communities. It's going to cause more harms, but we need to be pragmatic. We need to look at effectiveness of our approach, right from the prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and making, providing the options that are actually required. So this is the basic thing that we need to bring to the fore, the human rights violations. And these are the things that our policymakers need to see and understand that, look, the idea of being tough on drugs by militarization, human rights violations, and politicization of the response, we never change anything, but rather we need to focus on what works. And these are the things that require our investment.
Thank you very much. And I'll ask Francois to come in for UNODC's technical support on best examples. If you can share with us that briefly. Sorry, Francois. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, from our end, I think one of the key positive developments is the setting up of interministerial committees. So if you look at countries that have established interministerial committees on drugs, like again, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, for instance, what's interesting is that they create debate at the ministerial level on the type of data that they should be collecting, and it creates an impetus to collect that data across the ministries. And then you have a full picture, because if you have only the law enforcement agencies that collect the data on drugs, including on trafficking, this is particularly the case in the Sahel region, most of the reporting is done by law enforcement agencies, then it becomes difficult to get that wider view on what's happening on the drug market, and particularly what's happening at the local level, in terms of drug use. So I think where we would look at for positive examples, definitely countries that have interministerial committees such as Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, and there are a few others in the region. And this is important because once they have the data, they can really put policies and programming forward that meets the needs of the country, rather than being donor-led, rather than being given, funding of resources or technical assistance to address the needs maybe that other countries may have. If you look at cocaine trafficking, maybe cocaine use is not, the most pressing issue in the region, but so much resources are being added to controlling drug trafficking in the region. So I think once there are those data governance bodies in place, that helps to shape the country's understanding of the drug situation at the local, national level, and that it establishes stronger grounds to get resources from UN agencies, but from other technical and financial partners.
Thank you very much, Francois. So just to, since we still have about 10 to 15 minutes in the discussion to go finalize this round of questions, I will be asking the next question to you, Ved, to go back to the historian. And just to ask you very briefly, are there some models that existed under the colonial rule or even before during the centuries of use that can still be actually adopted and put today in modern institutions as issues of regulation that respond into a larger issues of regulation, as Isabel was addressing at the very beginning. And to Asmon, actually, also a question regarding Indonesia specifically, that was also a production country that we know that even had coca production under the Dutch colonial rule. Where is today the debate, for example, that existed 2 years ago on decriminalization in Indonesia, because we see the focus also on and the huge impact on the lowest offenses. Those are very much, that are still related to drug use that is being heavily criminalized. So thank you very much.
Right. I think this is a really important and a really broad question as well, because the pre-colonial regime or toleration or tolerance or social acceptance of drugs is something that hasn't sort of been in place for almost a century now. So it's very difficult to at some level, recover sort of those patterns of use and acceptability. The nature of drug use and also use of alcohol, which has similar social sanctions within the countries in the region. I think it's going to be difficult to have the conversation about drugs today by talking about the past. And this is something that I believe is a problem that historians don't really deal with. Because the nature of drug use, the patterns of use, and also socialization in general has changed. So if someone recommends that raw opium or cannabis in its sort of natural form should be legalized in India, because there's a historical case that suggests that use was perfectly okay 150 years back, I don't think there's going to be enough social or political appetite for that kind of conversation, especially in India. But what we can do is we can talk about how regulation of these drugs and their use was socially mandated. There were cultural mores that would regulate. Instead of criminalizing using the justice system, the criminal justice system, where there are very specific amounts or quantities that one can possess, and on that basis, whether one is a user or a dealer. I mean, it's a very complicated system that we have here in India. If we can sort of try and simplify some of those legalese in that sense, and make more pragmatic choices when it comes to helping users. That most recent back in India, they're trying to find solutions beyond methadone-assisted therapy for heroin use, for example. They're also trying to talk about, at some level, social mobilization, using women and women's self-help groups. Because drug use in India still is predominantly sort of among men. Female drug use is really not well understood. We know that there is use of all classes of drugs among females, but it's usually seen as a sort of a young man problem. And the recent report tries to provide community-oriented solutions. I don't know if that's a way forward, but I think that it is lateral thinking, and which is, I think, very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Asmon.
Yes, Khalid. Yes, is it true that during the colonializations, under the Dutch colonializations, we can see that Dutch empires try to control drugs in Indonesia, but not only how they consume, but also they produce and sell to around the globe. And Indonesians is really have a strong history how we can actually manage try to some models that the Dutch already use. But still, we have to be really careful on that, because the regulatory model that the Dutch colonialization have been done is really focused on the economic benefit in the terms of imperialism, but not for the property and increasing the economic benefit for the society. But after Indonesian independence, and Indonesia ratified the international drug controls, 3 of them, directly, and really obey on that until now. So what we try to challenge Indonesia's government to open mind and also see the articles that can be open gate for the progressive drugs policy. We try to do our best as about the debate on the scheduling, for example, because they really obey what the schedules under the international drug controls, and they interpret that all the drugs on all the first schedules, including cannabis, are prohibited in all circumstances. Now we debate on that because we think that this is one of the open discussions that really scientific. It's not only about the presumption, but it's really about the good research, and also how we can also try to evaluate the issue of colonizations versus decolonizations. Because I think this is the schedules and also the politics of the schedulings is the main topics when the drafter of the international drug control also begins the discussion about the cannabis, cocaine, and also maybe in some part of the Latin America, like coca leaf. In Indonesia also, but you know, the drafter is not from us, it's from most of the US, and US also, we follow US, Indonesian follow US very closely, including the approach. They also, Indonesian also claim that US is quite successful, including how the US can manage the illicit drug market through the death penalties. So I think this perspective should be challenged, and what we are doing right now is challenged through the how we can reinterpret the international drug control for the society and also the Indonesians' benefit on that.
Thank you very much, Asmon. And actually, you are speaking about an issue that is really key, which is of the international schedules and the international conventions, which will get me to the last question that I'll ask all of you. And I will try myself to say it in less than a minute to give you each a minute to respond, which is going to be a challenge. But so the conventions and the schedules, we know that they are nearly universal adherence to them. There's very lot of respect. We all see in the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs the commitment of members states, all of them, to transnational, to international cooperation, judicial cooperation, et cetera, and that they want to work this hand in hand. So let me ask a provocative question. Since there won't be, or there doesn't seem to be in the foreseeable future a consensus on changes even in the schedules, as we've seen with cannabis removal from Schedule 4 for medical use as well. It stays in one of the most addictive substances in Schedule 1. But since there isn't that consensus at the international level, is the way forward regional debates and regional discussions and regional political agreements and regional positions that are strong that then can be discussed at the multilateral level, and where blocs can come within their own concerns and their own solutions to then have a more open debate into local impacts of the system that is now implemented everywhere around the world. So I would give you the floor as you wish. I would go with Isabelle, of course, as well, Asmon, Ved, Adeolu, then Francois, if you agree, because this is how I see it in my screens as well. And first, Isabelle, thank you.
So very quickly, yes, I would think that the only way out now is to take it regionally or nationally, but with two concerns. One is that our bilateral, like Latin American, inter-American mechanism is very much US oriented. So there is not much room for reform there, would rather have to do it on a nation-to-nation basis rather than through the inter-American system, which is very much conservative. And also, how does the industry, specifically the cannabis industry, try to influence low and middle income countries to create frameworks that are not beneficial to local communities?
Thank you very much. That's really key also, and I hope that one day we will have soon a discussion also on the commercial interests and capture of the cannabis markets in the low and middle income countries. Asmon, I'll give you the floor, please, and then Ved, Adeolu, and Francois. Thank you.
Yeah, I think ASEAN countries is still far from the discussions how we can challenge the international drug control, including the schedules, I think. Indonesia and other countries in ASEAN is really focused on the its ASEAN drugs free till 2025. And just last week, ASEAN launched the ASEAN drug monitoring. Maybe from UNODC also familiar with this. ASEAN drug monitoring report really focus on the drug market and illicit drug market, but not discuss about the people who use drugs, and also how we can also increase the discussions about the benefit of drug itself. And ASEAN also have work plan communities until 2025 that describe the component, and 7 components, and most of the components really focus on the law enforcement and how they can create bilateral and multilateral agreement to reduce the illicit drug market, focusly in the golden triangles in ASEAN. So I think it's quite hard to hope that ASEAN as a regional mechanisms to reform the drugs policy in each national countries, except maybe if ASEAN countries will have economic cooperation with the EU, for example, because EU now have a strong commitment to legal audit, and one of the legal audit concerned about the human rights. So what we are doing in Indonesia, for example, try to interlink the discussion about the drugs policy to the human rights abuses, to the human rights record. And also what we are doing right now is try to interlink the human trafficking in the issue of drug mules to pursue that agreement among ASEAN countries not to punish the victims of human trafficking if they are victims of the human trafficking, including if they are drug mules. So we try to interlink many issues in multi-perspective. I agree with you, Isabel, and also Adlu. Multi-dimensions of human rights, I think it should be focused also in our discussion on drugs policy and reform. Thank you, Khalid.
I think very briefly, I'd say yes. I think that's the only way forward, but I'm not very optimistic about the region, South Asia and its sort of neighboring region. There are far too many political differences, instability, and also emerging sort of situations that makes it very difficult. But as a historian, I remember in the late 80s, after the 1988 convention, SARC, which was the regional body, the South Asian regional body, did have a meeting on drugs. And I believe the latest meeting that the SARC had, which did not come to any sort of consensus, has not taken place for more than a decade now. So, yeah, not very optimistic.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I would also want to agree and say yes. Having a regional debate, national debate or consultation on this issue should be the way forward. Of course, we can't fully think that we basically solve the problem, or the nations or the regions will definitely get it right. But I think it's going to open up the space where you have the different active players bring their evidence, on board, join the debate, the professional bodies. And I say this in respect of, for Africa, 2 major issues that has been being debated for a while now, talking about the issue around tramadol and issue around cannabis. We could see how some countries are already breaking out of the rank in terms of providing a legal regulation on cannabis. But you have many African countries where cannabis is mostly grown, still sticking to what the conventions are saying. And of course, we are also seeing how external bodies are pushing for scheduling of tramadol, whereas that is the very cheap go-to pain medication that is easily accessible within the African continent. So if we can, have these issues at the national, at the regional level, for a debate, for people to bring their opinion, their perspective on the table, I think it will provide more way forward than just having thinking internationally something is going to happen. And I think one of the things that Francois mentioned that I would love to reemphasize is, you mentioned the fact that when we have data being generated within our regions or at the country level, we can use that to engage development of donors and funders on what the priority issues are. The reverse has been the case, and we see how international aids, donor are actually driving the policy agenda within, the African region, where they, in a way, provide funding for certain specifics, and that becomes the priority policy direction for government, for them to implement. So this has been a kind of a challenging situation that we need to reverse the case. So if we begin to have the national consultation, voices around the table, stakeholders having an opinion and not just about the politics, because like they often say, sometimes or many times, bad drug policies are good politics. So if we try to push aside the politics and face the reality, I think we will make a headway.
Thank you, Adeolu. I think you walked on my tongue, as we say here. But yes, I think it's exactly this. It's by having strong evidence at the local level that will then inform policy making at the national level that can then shape regional discussions that will have influence at the multilateral level. I think if we have that first line of evidence, that will help shape the agenda. If you look at the tramadol, and I'd like to emphasize this because it's been raised by Adeolu before, but the fact that you have people were surprised to hear that between 2011 and 2017, 80% of the tramadol that was seized in the world was seized in or en route to West Africa. So that's a figure, and people are like, oh, we need better control on tramadol, we need better control. But what the dichotomy here, or the other line, is also that West Africa is also the region which has the lowest availability of painkillers. Of legal access to painkillers. And unless this kind of evidence and unless this kind of analysis is done at the national level, then you'll always have this, control approach that is not supported by the evidence on what's happening on the ground and why, it may be that a drug is thriving in the region. So you need that overall understanding, and the only way to get that level of understanding is by having more evidence at the national level.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the five of you for this final response, and also for being here today for this 1 hour and a half of discussion. We're coming to an end of our meeting here at the Policy Center for the New South, but I would say that as a moderator, what I take really out of this discussion is mostly that beyond the technical tools that exist to have different responses in different parts of the world that are there, the funding still focuses on the political priorities, and funding and budgeting and policy choices still focus on the war on drugs approach, which had benefited from one of the US administration's full support in 1971 and priority. And so that prioritization remains within the drug control frameworks of different parts of the world. But I also heard today a lot of small scale, but quite interesting, innovative approaches, programs that are being put on the ground, pilot projects and trials, etc. And also what I've seen mostly is a lot of commitment with people that are putting forward and still challenging all the different aspects and human rights violations that occur and still occurring, as has been reported by many, many different human rights mechanisms, regional and international, around the world in the name of drug control. So the question now there remains still the fact of after a decade of high political priority, how to keep it alive and also how to get those good examples of reform ongoing and also to get the ownership in the low and middle income countries of those. So I would say that we have been really, really grateful to have such expertise today. And thank you, all of you, Isabel Pereira, Asmon, Francisca, Ved Barwa, Adeolu, Adibi, and Francois Patuel. And thank you really for giving us our time and for being here. Thank, of course, the Policy Center for the New South for giving us the space for this discussion. And I hope these debates will continue. We've heard a lot today about the issue of tramadol and of access to medicines. That is a big, big problem for our countries as well that need to be put forward. And also, of course, for the specific debate, the Global Commission and the West Africa Commissions on Drugs, both of them for also their sponsorship. And just finally to say that tomorrow at exactly the same time, there will be another debate on drug policy that will include President Khalid Motlanthe from South Africa, Dr. Mohamed Baradei from Egypt, and Dr. Meir Chineri Hessi from Ghana and the West Africa Commission on Drugs. And it will be about the political leadership and the call for reform specifically in our African continent, although we would welcome all of our friends from all over the world and not only from LMICs, but from everywhere as well in every different region in the world. So once again, thank you very much. And I hope that this debate has been as enriching to all the audiences as it was to me in learning from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.